2021 in our 40-year celebration. I'm very, very honored to welcome Anja Kovacs as the 5th speaker in our series, who's going to be speaking on bodies that matter towards a feminist approach to data governance. With a background in the field of development studies, Dr. Anja Kovacs directs the Internet Democracy Project in Delhi in India. The project works towards realizing feminist visions of the digital in society by exploring and addressing power imbalances in the areas of norms, governance, and infrastructure in India and beyond. Anja's research and advocacy currently focuses on questions regarding data governance, surveillance, and cybersecurity, and regarding freedom of expression, including work on gender, bodies, surveillance, gender, and online abuse. She has also conducted extensive research on the architecture of internet governance. Anja has been a member of the investment committee of the Digital Defenders Partnership and of the steering committee of Best Bits, a global network of civil society members, and is currently a member of the board of governors of Whereas One. She has worked as an international consultant on internet issues, including for the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, the United Nations Development Programme Asia Pacific, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, as well as having been a fellow at the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. She is currently also a Cyber BRICS Fellow at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Prior to focusing on her work on information society, Anja has been researching and consulting on a wide range of development-related issues. She has lectured at the University of East Anglia in the UK and Ambedkar University, Delhi here, as well as guest lectured at universities in India and Brazil, and has conducted extensive field work throughout South Asia. I'm very happy to introduce you, Anja, and over to you now. Just to let everyone know, as is now usual practice, please keep yourselves muted and your videos also, I would say, off to maximize the potential of bandwidth. We welcome, after Anja has given her presentation, which will include a PPT, we welcome your questions and comments. They can either be introduced in the chat mode, which is available to you, or if you wish to speak personally, then unmute yourself and ask your question, and Anja will respond. So over to you, Anja. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary, for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak here today. It's truly a great honor to speak on such an occasion and for such an institution. A very happy birthday to CWDS. I actually first came to CWDS 20 years ago when I first came to India as well, to meet Dr. Vasanti Raman to discuss some questions I had about my PhD research, which was on a field that she had worked in herself as well. And as is her habit, she welcomed me very warmly in the CWDS offices, got some tea, we chatted a bit, and then she asked me in a very straightforward manner, so are you one of those who is in and out, or are you here to do this properly? And that question really stayed with me clearly since I'm still here 20 years later. But it also I felt really was the kind of question that comes out of the feminism that CWDS stands for, which is about really understanding local contexts, being rooted in local realities, being aware of power relations at all times, and understanding that always has to be at the heart of our work. And so it's really a great honor for me to be here today and to share with you some of the work that we are developing at the Internet Democracy Project, and that tries to root itself in a very similar kind of feminism, though perhaps on a somewhat new and not so much developed issue yet within feminism. But what I hope my lecture today will make clear is that there is a lot of scope for contributions for feminism to make to this specific field. And so the work I will talk about today is something that we have been working on for about 2-3 years now. And so the starting point is really the intersection between our bodies and our data, and that this particular intersection is something that we need to look at in much more depth. Some people are already talking about bodies and data, but a lot of that work really focuses on things like menstruation apps and the like. So specific instances in which our bodies are actually translated in data. The argument I'm trying to make today is that there is a much more fundamental shift happening. That data is really emerging as a fundamental extension, or one could even argue an integral part of our bodies. That in its essence is really a paradigm shift in how we should conceptualize our bodies at a fundamental level. And the second step in the argument is then that if we can see that connection and if we can see that shift in how bodies should be defined today in these new realities, a lot of the problems that we have in the digital society can actually more easily be resolved through this new lens. So today I want to first diagnose the cause of the problems we face and the harms these lead to, and then go into the shift that I'm arguing that we are seeing and how acknowledging that might provide some solutions. So basically I'll proceed in 4 parts. And like I said, the focus here is very much not gender and data, but a feminist approach to data. Can I have the presentation? Yeah, we can move to the next slide. Let's first of all start from the question, what is data really? Because with the increasing datafication of our bodies and our lives, how we speak about data really matters. And at present, the understandings of data are overwhelmingly disembodied. There are so many metaphors that are used to speak about data in general and big data in particular that all exemplify that. Let's move to the next slide. This is one representation of one of those definitions that is very common, the idea that data is oil that needs to be somehow excavated. Others are that data is an ocean that we are swimming in, that it's a tsunami that might drown us, that it's raw and so a resource that needs to be mined. That argument also often goes for the data as oil metaphor. Some say that data is the exhaust of our daily lives, or that it's radioactive. And it's also spoken as a currency or an asset. In fact, in a lot of Indian government documents, it's often treated like that. And data is even talked about there as a national asset that the government should therefore have control over. Now, according to the scholars Cornelius Puschmann and Jean Burgess, there are 2 discursive strands that dominate in these metaphors of data. The first one is big data as a naturally occurring resource that needs to be uncovered, claimed, controlled, valued, and traded through using appropriate technology, so that in that way we can capitalize on its potential. Please, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, this one. We're still on that one. So this first one is that idea of a natural resource which has to be uncovered. And the second one really builds on that. It's a big data as nourishment or fuel to be consumed. And that's kind of the language that is behind data driving inevitable decisions and actions, as well as innovation and growth. But so these metaphors that we are using predominantly to speak data have important consequences. Now let's go to the next slide. The controlling metaphor really defines the moral burden of the project for which data is used. Metaphors have baggage. They have all kinds of assumptions embedded in them that are based on the physical analogs from which they draw. And using metaphors embeds these assumptions in the discussion. Judges and other decision makers also look to how physical analogs are already regulated when they consider how data should be governed. And so when we use a particular metaphor, it will have material consequences in that sense as well. And so coming back to these dominant strands of data as a natural resource, what they are essentially saying is you cannot regulate data, right? That's again also that idea of data as a tsunami. Like there's no regulating a tsunami. It cannot be contained either. You can at best harness its force. Data has potentially great value, but that can only be unlocked as if it's already inherent to the data itself by experts and large-scale industrial processes. The metaphor also naturalizes and depersonalizes data in its collection, portraying it as ripe for exploitation and personal gain. And there are some who have argued that this actually has very close parallels with how historical colonialism has worked in terms of justifying exploitation of both people and resources, including land, in the developing world. Let's move to the next slide. Of course, the reality is often different, right? Essentially, people's agency and creativity are not central to many of these data sets. But what we see is that they actually play a really important role in creating the data. Cushman and Burgess again have argued data is not a natural resource that replenishes itself. It's created by users with intentions entirely unrelated to its use as a valued commodity. It's created by humans and recorded by machines rather than simply being discovered and claimed by platform providers or third parties. And Lemov has similarly said, data traces are actually made up of people. So these scholars have already come to recognize that there is a role that people play that actually fundamentally disappears from view because of the metaphors we use, which mask the human behaviors, the relationships, the communication that make up all that data that we are streaming and mining. So people, bodies, agency, identity, all disappears, even if it's actually central to the data and its flows. People are just nowhere to be found. Let's move to the next slide. Now, these disembodied understandings of data have led to a number of deep harms, though some also would argue that these come together with potentials. The first one is a harm of epistemology. Can we go to the next slide? There's some music outside of my window. I'm not sure if that's disturbing you all. It's moving on, great. The question of epistemology. So it's important to understand where the disembodied understandings of data come from. They are fundamentally rooted in the discipline of cybernetics, which basically started to flourish close after the Second World War, in which information is thought of as informing everything, but a layer that is independent from the medium that is carrying it. So it can easily be transferred from one medium to the next without actually affecting the medium that it is in. So that is what makes possible the talk we do about data as oil, data as a resource. Data is something that's out there up for grabs. This thinking has really, really deeply impacted the world. And the illustration on the slide is referring to the idea that you can download a human brain into a computer, which some computer scientists are concretely exploring. And this idea has been quite alive for decades now, actually. So the idea is that if you don't put a brain in a computer, it's still supposedly the brain of that human being, even though it is not in the body of that human being anymore. The questions of epistemology come up though, because the narrative around this kind of understanding of data as something that is supposedly a layer in everything is that it's also been given enormous power, right? The language is about raw data. So basically, the more data you get, the more you will know about the world. Data supposedly will tell the truth. Actually, one scholar has even argued that the best metaphor for data at the moment is perhaps that of nudity, Because really it is when all of our data is visible, we stand naked. Data makes us transparent. In other words, the disembodied understandings of data and this idea that data tells the truth has driven a new positivism that feminism actually has long criticized. In reality, technology and data abstraction, as anything else, are imbricated in power relations in many ways, often with deeply gendered consequences. But the contextual, the social, the relational aspects of our existence often disappear from view in these understandings of the world. Yes, and like to further understand the harms these disembodied conceptualizations have led to, we need to examine a further shift that the same cybernetic paradigm and these disembodied understandings of data have made possible, and that's how surveillance works. And that's indeed the next slide. Thank you. So bodies have always been central to surveillance. That's not new, but how is radically changing? Traditionally, for those of us who were adults already in the 90s, I think, up until then, surveillance was often talked about as monitoring. Surveillance was meant to be about what you have done or what you are currently doing. And the image on the left is, of course, George Orwell, 1984, Big Brother is watching you, which is really emblematic for that kind of thinking. This was often discussed, this kind of monitoring as surveillance, when we talk about surveillance and security. Historically, also when we talk about human rights violations, and in many ways, it was still the dominant way we looked at surveillance when the Snowden revelations happened, which were really about this as a danger that our lives were being monitored now in ways that didn't exist before. Around this particular type of surveillance, there was also a fairly stable consensus on the circumstances and to what extent monitoring is acceptable until a few years ago. And in India, that consensus was largely driven by Supreme Court cases in the 90s that laid out a bunch of rules. But this is not the only form of surveillance. On the right side of the image, we see the panopticon, which is about surveillance to shape behavior going forward. The panopticon, many people know already, was designed by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century, and it allows, it's a model for a jail, and it allows the inmates of an institution to be watched by a single watchman, but without being able to tell whether or not they are being watched at any particular moment. What this model did then was make possible the internalization of discipline by the inmates by incentivizing some kinds of behavior and discouraging others. And when Foucault revived the concept in Discipline and Punish, he saw it really this form of surveillance as central to governance in modern societies. And his point was that all modern institutions are really have this deeply ingrained, whether it's hospitals, whether it's educational institutions, as well as jails, of course. The goal here is to create docile bodies. So surveillance is then preemptive because the idea is that you control now so you don't have to repress later. It's also productive because it actually makes us do certain things, or at least that's the intention. And of course, the possibilities to shape behavior have become even more extensive with big data. So both of these forms of surveillance are very much still existing. On the shaping behavior, for example, all the concerns around how data has been used to influence elections is a really good example of shaping behavior going forward. But that particular example actually relies on the ability to target people in a much more fine-grained manner than was ever possible before. And that really relates to a further shift in surveillance, which is exemplary of how surveillance works today. This is the next image. This has been called by Haggerty and Erickson the surveillance assemblage. Can I have the next slide, please? Can we have the next slide? Okay, I'll just continue. It will be helpful to have the image though to really get a sense of what.
Actually, there's a bit of a problem, so I'm just finding out why he's not able to move forward.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just continue.
Just continue.
The image I wanted to show was of a rhizome, which is a weed that is connected under the ground, but you can't see that over the ground. And this is really the defining image for surveillance today. What you have here is multiple actors working together as a unity to surveil. And we ourselves are often part of that. So if you use any kind of tracker for your health, for example, a Fitbit, anything of that sort, you yourself are part of a surveillance assemblage where you're a starting point. The company behind the device you use as part of that assemblage, third parties where that data is going as part of that assemblage. When the government or a court wants access to that data, they are part of that assemblage. So it's not anymore that you can pinpoint this one actor where you can say, as in the big brother is watching you age, it was the government we would focus on for rules. That does not work anymore. What's also shifted is not just that there are multiple actors, but that now surveillance is really about capturing flows of data. So it is much more liquid and moving. It's also about capturing the flow so that you could potentially direct or govern the action of others. That's always a potential though, that doesn't necessarily materialize, though sometimes it does. And in some cases, it also institutionalizes. So for example, you could say that Facebook is an institutionalized actor in surveillance assemblages, but many of us are not, could do much more surveillance for ourselves than we are actually doing on ourselves. And sometimes it materializes, sometimes not. What's new then about this form of surveillance, beyond these characteristics I just explained? First of all, it's everywhere. As soon as you are using a device, that kind of surveillance comes into play. It also doesn't need to see us or have us in its vision in our totality. That's really a fundamental difference as well with both the panopticon and the big brother is watching you model, where it was the entirety of our body that was also always being watched. Right now, what we see is that the body instead is broken down into information, access to resources, services, power. There we go. That's the image of the rhizome. Thank you. And because our bodies are broken down into information, they're also made more mobile and comparable. All of this means that surveillance is now fundamentally unstable, making our earlier strategy of resistance also ineffectual. It means the surveillance is more dispersed, that discipline and punishment are fundamentally distributed unevenly because the flow that is captured that relates to you is not necessarily the same flow that's captured as it relates to me. It also means that we are not all subject to the same gaze. And all of this actually reproduces inequalities because we are put into these separate boxes. It becomes really hard to know collectively what is going on and then what is an effective strategy to fight back. And all of this also happens with context being removed. This comes back to this positive fist, disembodied approach to data. If the data in itself is believed to tell the truth, the context is no longer relevant and not taken into account. And again, for the perpetuation of inequalities, that has really important consequences. The shifts in surveillance that I have described have losses that have always been associated with surveillance, the loss of privacy, also the disciplinary power of surveillance, where it actually, surveillance is often used to make us try and fit a particular norm. But the surveillance assemblage makes possible two further harms that I have already touched on, at least. Let's move to the next slide, please. The first one is the discrimination that's inherent in abstraction. This is an image for those of you who've traveled in countries where in the airport they have these full body scanners. You have to go and stand in that in the scanner in this particular position. Individuals have little control over the data as such. That's true of all of us, especially problematic though, because some people have always been more surveilled. And so they're either underrepresented in some cases in the data, like gender is historically lacking in many data sets as a category, but there can also be an over-representation of particular bodies and cells, and that leads to hypervisibility. It's also problematic that we don't have control over what data as such is taken from us, because a lot of the digital world relies on information of the past to represent the future. That's really what algorithms do, right? They build on data from the past. Now, in the context of India, let's look, for example, at predictive policing, which is being rolled out in a number of states in the country. Let's stay on the previous one. Thank you. I'm going to come back to this image. The previous one, please. Thank you. So let's look at predictive policing. In Karnataka, between 2012 and 2016, transgender people were specifically targeted in the police manuals, which made it possible for the police to, on very flimsy grounds, put transgender people in preventive detention. That is not only something that happens in Karnataka, it also does not only happen to transgender people, what are formerly called denotified tribes. Also in many states, still laws exist where people from those backgrounds, though the language being used today is slightly different, are just much more likely to be put in preventive detention. If we see these kind of historical patterns, which the people in question have no control over, and which are often used by the police simply to show that, for example, if a child disappears in an area, that they are doing something, then obviously these people are going to show up disproportionately in police statistics. If that's a bias you do not take into account, predictive policing is indeed going to predict where the policing will happen, not necessarily who is guilty of the crimes. The second issue that people have little control over, or that we as individuals have little control over, is how categories are formed and which one we are slotted into. So there is an opaqueness around all of this. And for example, and now I want to come back to these airport full body scanners. Feminists, transgenders, activists, and others have been arguing for decades now that gender is not a binary, but a spectrum. And yet, surveillance efforts still tend to treat individuals as either male or female, and in doing so, reinforce those norms. So when you're standing in that scanner, before you step into it, the official who is manning the scanner actually has to choose whether you are gender or not. And when transgender people have to go through these procedures, the likelihood that they are being put in the wrong category is fairly big, or that the official just gets confused because their body doesn't match, the image that comes up of their body doesn't match the expectation of that particular officer. And so that means that transgender people are disproportionately patted down manually after having gone through this procedure. The question then is also, again, will a male or female officer do that? And will they have any control over this? This leads to really deeply disturbing situations for people who are affected by this directly. There's also examples that we are perhaps less immediately visible to us. Many of you might have noticed if you are on Facebook, that over the years, the gender category on Facebook has undergone fundamental changes. It started with just male or female, and now the latest was that you could actually put down your gender yourself. This seems like a great way to allow people to fully express who they are. The thing is, when you signed up for Facebook, at least the last time I checked, you still had to choose male or female. And when Facebook gives your data to advertisers, it still treats you as male or female. So all this wonderful gender representation that we might think we are able to do at the forefront, actually at the back end doesn't exist. Facebook still decides what you are there. Can we move to the next slide? What is also already indicates then is that there is a harm related to representation as well. And I think the questions of discrimination come up more often. The ones on representation, far less. The slides, I'm not sure you can see it very well, but this was a controversy that was flagged by Sashi Tharoor in 2017 about how North Indian masala and South Indian masala were depicted if you did an image search on Google. And this is from above the fold. I think I took these images in December 2019. So I have not checked again today, I admit, but even at that time, more than 2 years after it was flagged, when you see North Indian masala, it is it's overwhelmingly images of masala that you use to make food. When you look at South Indian masala, there are many more images of actresses, models, etc., who have been slotted in that category. It raises the question, does the data actually reflect or represent what we look for, or does it construct the categories, right? And also, if it constructs the categories, as in the case of those full body scanners in the airport, everybody who does not fit the norm set by the machine becomes deviant, right? Which is why not just transgender people, actually also, for example, people who have a higher body weight are disproportionately pulled out of the line for a second body part. I wanted to give the example of the North Indian and South Indian masala though, because the models or actresses who showed up as South Indian masala did not have any say in this, right? And I use this example, but actually Safiya Noble, a North American scholar who's Black herself, first flagged the problems with these algorithms when she was playing with her nieces in 2009 and Googled Black girls and did this image search, and everything that came up on the first page was porn. And her point was, in the context of the struggles around civil and political rights that Black people had in the US, what does it mean that after years of fighting for better representation, including in images on the media, we are now being set back decades when it comes to the internet, right? Fundamentally, all of us are experiencing here a loss of agency and voice that has tremendous repercussions for our struggles of representation as well. So in all of this, basically, the absence of context, the fact that we don't have a say about it becomes a big problem. Like I said, they're not merely problems of privacy, they're also problems of discrimination, of representation, of social justice. But because surveillance is so individually targeted now, this collective dimension to many of these problems is often really difficult to establish. Also because a lot of what happens is so opaque, right? So if it's individually targeted and opaque, it's really difficult to find out what happens. Coming back to the questions of how should we talk about data? Data as oil makes it sound as if gathering and analyzing data is always a good thing. But bringing context, people, bodies back in reminds us that not all algorithms actually have equal value. Can we move to the next slide, please? Sorry. So the previous slide was from the North Indian masala, and this is the South Indian masala. So now you can see the difference more clearly, right? Let's move to the next one, please. So this is a fairly depressing picture I'm painting, but I do believe that there is hope, and that is really by putting bodies back at the center of this debate. And let's move to the next slide, please. There is growing attention for the fact that our subjectivity is being mined for data as well as targeted by decisions based on data. And there is more and more talk about the loss of autonomy and agency that as individuals we end up experiencing because of that, sometimes not even consciously. What's interesting though is that in many of these discussions, we see a privileging of the mind over the body. It's as if subjectivity is only a matter of the mind. And so there is a lot of focus on that we lose choice, that we lose the capacity to make decisions. These are of course, very, very important aspects, but they do not tell the entire story. There are aspects of our subjectivity that are related to the body, including affect, and that fall out of their purview if we only focus on the mind. There is an additional angle in that the concrete grounding of our subjectivity is actually provided by our bodies and the way they engage with their environment, right? And so if we only talk about the mind, that also continues to be occluded. In particular, our bodies are central in two ways. First, the socially constructed body that each of us inhabit is always the material medium without which data would not exist. Even when we're talking about our innermost thoughts, they can only be accessed when they are externalized or expressed in some way, right? We have to still, for example, type how to alleviate depression for, say, Google to know that this might be something that we are suffering from. In addition, the shape and the nature of all the data that we generate is influenced by the ways in which we use our bodies to orient ourselves to the world and are in turn received by the world. So this means that they're deeply shaped by the social construction of our bodies, in short, right? So on the one hand, it's our socially constructed body that is the material medium that generates the data, but also data is used to affect the actions of our socially constructed bodies. In fact, that's what most of the companies today that are data-driven are really trying to do, right? They're trying to make us take particular actions rather than others. In other words, our bodies really are the linchpin in the creation of data flows, but also in the channeling and even weaponizing of their impact. And once we can recognize that, we can see that taking this as our starting point, that our subjectivity is grounded in our bodies, can give us much more concrete insight into the challenges that datafication is posing for the development of our subjectivity, and also what changes we need to counter these trends and ensure that datafication works for rather than against us. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, a number of authors have then proposed ways forward to both acknowledge and understand these shifts more fully so that we can find ways to address them appropriately where needed. But there's really two different approaches here. The first one is exemplified by a thinker like Sarah Watson, who argues that we need metaphors that tie data to our bodies. So she gives examples of data as shadow, data as footprint, data as blood, data as DNA. All of these are attempts to kind of recenter the subject rather than the larger structural changes in how we talk about data. But other scholars go even further. And these are the people that in our work we are following very closely. In particular, Irma van der Ploeg has argued that acknowledging that the definition of our bodies is undergoing a paradigmatic shift is crucial as the line between our virtual and our physical bodies becomes irrelevant. So as our bodies are broken down into information, and decisions about our access to resources, to networks, to services, to powers are increasingly based on that. The fact that that data is supposedly removed from us doesn't actually matter anymore in practice. The image here is from the late Middle Ages in Europe. When in the Middle Ages in Europe, bodies were seen as this mystical thing given by God, right? And scientists were banned by the church from actually cutting open people. And that started to shift in the 15th, 16th century, but with actually starting to cut open bodies to see what was inside. It's not just that modern medicine started to evolve in Europe in a different direction, etc., but a whole different conceptualization of the world emerged, right? So for example, the way we can relate today particular moods to where we are in our menstrual cycle, for example, are things that would not have been possible in the Middle Ages. We make sense of the world also by understanding these processes. So one of the proof's argument is this was a paradigmatic shift in how we understood the body some 500 years ago. And what we are going through now is actually equally fundamental. This is not a matter of metaphor anymore. This is a really embodied, deep experience. And there's other thinkers who started to acknowledge this as well, who talk about data as an extension of our will and agency, who recognize that data even materially alters our bodies. And I wanted to give two examples to make all of this a little bit more tangible. The first one is from the perspective of our experiences. Let's move to the next slide, please. And I wanted to use a case here, a court case actually that happened in India, a judgment in 2018, which is really remarkable for how sensitive it is to these changes. So it is a judgment of the trial court in Medinipur district in West Bengal, in the case state of West Bengal versus Animesh Bokshi. And so what happened was the case was filed by a young woman who, at the request of the accused, sent him private pictures, sexual images. She did that with her consent. He then wanted to go on an outing with her, and when she refused, he threatened to post those images on social media. Then he obtained her password from her diary and accessed nude photos and videos that he had asked her to take earlier, and actually uploaded them on Pornhub, making sure that it would be easy to identify her by name for everybody who would watch the images. And the judgment is really remarkable. First of all, because it did not involve any slut shaming. The judge was firmly on the side of the victim, which I think it's sad to say that that's not standard still, but it isn't. So, and the accused was convicted to 5 years of imprisonment, 9,000 rupees fine. The victim got access to the victim compensation scheme as well. But in addition, what really struck me in that judgment was that the judge described the non-consensual sharing of sexual images, like the uploading of these images on Pornhub, as virtual rape. Now, this has no statutory meaning under Indian law, and it suffers from definitional problems, virtual rape, because under Indian law, as almost anywhere else in the world that I know of, physical body contact into the vaginas, urethra, anus, or mouth of a woman is required to constitute rape. And so virtual rape can't be a legal offense in that sense. But why it's still noteworthy is that there was an attempt here to reduce the gap between how we understand online and offline gender-based violence, and to reduce the incorrect understanding that we often have of online violence, and that shapes our thinking of such violations. So non-consensual sharing of sexual images is mostly seen through the lens of a privacy violation and the need to protect the sexual privacy of individuals, which means that every country that I know of treats this under data protection or privacy laws, right? That's a challenge in a country like India, where privacy is often a duty for women more than a right. And so that's how women are then being told, yeah, but you shouldn't have shared this in the first place, right? But victims do not experience the non-consensual sharing of sexual images as just a privacy violation. They actually talk about it as an experience that is very similar to sexual assault. And so it's a violation of bodily integrity. At the moment, though, that link is something that we do not have a language to address, because we talk about data in these disembodied ways that I described earlier. And what's remarkable about this judgment is that this judge was actually sensitive to that shift and acknowledging the fact that the harm and the experience of the woman is not fully captured by the law at the moment. The second example I wanted to give is, can we have the next slide, please? Is about the same perspective, but from the view of how the state treats us. Our virtual bodies are actually often privileged now over our physical bodies. And the image here is, of course, of a ration shop. As many of you already know, between 2015 and 2018, more than half of all hunger-related deaths in India were, the deaths that were reported were related to issues that had to do with Aadhaar in one way or the other. It's a really stunning situation that you go to the ration shop, the shopkeeper might have known your family for 30 years. They might know that you are exactly who you say you are. But if the system doesn't recognize you as such, if the technology doesn't say that you are who you say you are, none of that matters anymore. And so this is, again, an example where Van der Kloef's comment that the line between our virtual and physical bodies really is becoming irrelevant is so stark, right? Because here it then becomes a matter of life and death, really. Finally, I want to very briefly look at what actually changes when we put bodies back at the center of data governance and give you some very concrete examples beyond the ones I've discussed so far. Can we go to the next slide? I think it's empowering to recognize that this paradigm shift is happening. At the individual level, we can start thinking about the kinds of protections we need. So I already gave that example of moving from data protection to bodily integrity frameworks, not just for the non-consensual sharing of sexual images. I think for biometrics, for example, there is a lot of potential in these frameworks as well. But also at the structural level, the body or our bodies and our experiences, embodied experiences as the starting point for investigating the relationships that the datafied society puts us in and how these surveillance assemblages that we talked about earlier works, whose knowledge, whose perspectives are highlighted, whose interests are being served. The next slide, please. I wanted to just mention a concrete example of how consent is being dealt in data governance, which I wrote a paper about with a colleague, which has a much more detailed analysis. But basically, in a nutshell, what we wanted to look into deeper is how consent is currently portrayed as a mechanism to facilitate autonomy in data governance. Privacy self-management is the frame. But it's also already heavily criticized. And I won't go through this long list of criticisms in detail, but if you look, for example, at the one, users are unaware of the business models of data fiduciaries, so companies like Facebook, it's a fact that what we think they take the data for and what they actually want the data for are often not the same things, because the service that we are offered is often not the actual thing that the company in question is making money on. In addition, many people are not aware of how widely their data is actually shared with third parties. They're even less aware of how what happens when their data that they have now given consent to is aggregated by the company with other data that the company might already have access to, being a third party. All of this is obfuscated through the legalese that's used in consent forms. And in general, users have no option but to accept everything or not use the service. So basically, rather than enabling our autonomy, what these consent regimes do is rather the opposite. They put a very high responsibility on us as users for whatever situation we might find ourselves in. And if something goes wrong, it's our fault, which is very much the same line that a lot of young women whose nudes might have been leaked somehow are given as well. Why did you share this in the first place? And if you shared it, then surely it's your fault. Keeping our data safe somehow becomes our responsibility. Our argument is that to strengthen these regimes, starting from the acknowledgement that we need to put our bodies back into the debate, is a real possible way forward. And if we move to the next slide. So what we did was we looked at feminist perspectives specifically on sexual consent, because that has been such a rich debate where bodies and minds in that intersection is also central. And we tried to understand better what can those perspectives teach us about how substantive consent should actually work. Now, consent, of course, remains controversial even within feminism, right? But to the extent that there are scholars that believe that it can be strengthened, the starting point is always that you need to recognize that consent is embedded in power relations. What we see is that consent forms in data governance presume that all of us are free and equal, and so have exactly the same capacity to consent or not. What feminism has highlighted is that in practice, not all of us are so equally free and equal, and that needs to be addressed. Again, I'm not going to go through all the principles in detail now, but I think of this set that's on the slide, the first and the last one are perhaps the most transformative, right? The idea that autonomy is not individual, but relational. And so if autonomy is relational, that means you need to look at the kind of relationship that is needed to make meaningful consent actually a real possibility that can bring us closer to the ideal of being free and equal. And the last one, conditions must be created so that consent can be freely given. This, of course, puts power relationships at the heart of consent, right? And it recognizes that some individuals are compelled to give consent, because of which it loses its essence and actually becomes a mechanism to inflict oppression and violence rather than autonomy. There are many examples of this in practice. If you look, for example, at the violence against women in India, consent is often irrelevant, sadly, in practice. Specific situations like classrooms or work settings have been recognized for this. Sometimes also in less tangible ways, when teenagers engage in sex because of peer pressure, for example. But what feminism then really put forward is that meaningful consent requires that power relations are not merely understood, but addressed. And so let's move to the final slide. If we then look at what it means for data governance, it really brings out that by individualizing the burden of taking decisions through consent, we are depoliticizing, even invisibilizing the impact of existing data infrastructure and the power relationships that structure them on our bodies and our lives. And all of that means that we don't even have a language to address of these issues really. If you do adopt a feminist perspective on consent that recognize this entanglement between bodies and data, in the paper we outline changes that are required at 3 levels. I just wanted to give one example which basically relates, I guess, to the second one, changes required to what are permissible uses of collected data. So The image on the left is one of physiognomy together with phrenology. These were very popular pseudosciences in the 19th century that measured skulls or appearance to determine mental traits and character. These were shown up as pseudosciences, especially in the 20th century, after much harm had already been done, and in an important, to an important extent, also because of civil rights struggles that happened all over the world. And yet what we see today is that these kind of ideas are really re-emerging. So there were two scholars, one of whom was at Stanford, so not, a prestigious university, Michael Kosinski and Yulin Wang, who trained an algorithm to identify people's sexual orientation from their facial features. And then they found that it did considerably better at predicting than human beings did so. But one should really ask, should such a question even be allowed to be asked? And should we be able to give our consent, even if we ask? Is this something that should be made possible? Because such an algorithm is just fundamentally irresponsible, right? Even in India, where the legalization of homosexual relationships is fairly recent, imagine you have an algorithm like that. What it does in the many countries where this is still illegal, right? Or even if you live in a society where it is legal, but you don't want this to get out. Plus, these algorithms are never without fault either. So just ethics around these kind of questions are massive. And I think we sometimes forget when with the abolishment of slavery, the development of human rights, there was in no democratic country in the world, can you consent, for example, to sell yourself into slavery? We have argued that this is a fundamental part of the right to life, that this is not something to live a life of dignity that we should even be allowed to consider. Surely there are questions like that as well to be asked when it comes to data governance. And I think what I hope this lecture has kind of started to put forward is that feminism has a lot to contribute because of that very strong rootedness it has in context and power relationships and the embodied lived experiences of people, to asking what those questions should be and what really should change, and to kind of, as we try to do in the paper on consent, to develop both a roadmap for the way forward and to give us a language with which to start talking about this. I leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja, for actually raising a host of issues. For many of us who are not familiar with the world of internet and data governance, you actually brought the issues that we are perhaps to some extent more familiar with in our research in the field of women's studies and feminism, and seem to hold out a promise that in fact this kind of work that was prior to and outside of the world of data, as you is that in fact, and that is what I found most interesting, that you saw a very close connect between what you would think of as the more progressive ways of connecting to the issues and the challenges of data governance and feminism. So it's almost as though, it's not that feminism is prescient in any way. It's not that feminism can imagine a world that it had no part in producing, but you seem to indicate that it could indeed have something to offer this world that it has, in and of itself, not played any part in creating. So that encompassing capacity, because we tend to think of feminism as a very specific, partial. We are overly concerned not to overgeneralize, to locate our feminisms very carefully, and all of that. I don't have to rehearse all that with you. And you were offering a different way of thinking. That is to say, you are saying, no, let us enlarge the scope of a feminist approach to be able to actually address some of the tough questions And you even seem to indicate that some of the mainstream approaches towards data governance were actually faulty or fell short in some ways of what in fact is our relationship to data. So I guess that's the sense in which you're hopeful in a situation where otherwise we feel so disempowered, right? I mean, you seem to think that we have certain tools, if I may use that term toolkit here, that we do have certain tools in our worlds that we can actually bring to bear here productively. And I thought that was really, really interesting. I have to think about that because, as I said, I'm not the world of data governance is not a world that I have engaged with extensively. So now we can actually open it up for questions and comments of all kinds. And as I said, you can use the chat function, or since our numbers are not so large, we're just over 50 here, you can also unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and raise a question in person.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes, Rajni, but you're a little distorted, at least.
Well, my voice, no, my face is distorted.
No, face is as beautiful as ever. It's the voice.
Distorted as ever. Is this any better?
Yeah, a bit better. Please go ahead, and we'll figure it out.
Thank you, Anja, for a lecture which, as Mary said, really opened up a lot of areas for those of us who've been worried about, but not really thought about and not really had the skills to do so. There's one question which I've been sort of, as you've been speaking, I've been thinking of, as you've pointed out in your lecture, that a lot of the sort of discourses have moved forward as though context didn't matter. And that becomes very critical. And in terms of context, you've particularly pointed out how power relations and power structures become important. But I was wondering that, that is still leaving context at almost, one could say, an acontextual level. It is so broad, so general. And while it is absolutely true what you're saying, one also wonders very often in these sorts of discussions, context can, okay, let me just say, when you talked about the paradigm shift in terms of the body, which took place, I was thinking, okay, but that paradigm shift is not the sort of shift which we might have experienced here, because it was a different context. But the argument, totally appealed. Now, what happens is that in our context is often brought in to argue against the sorts of concerns which we might be raising, which we might be wanting to talk about, where, okay, basically what I'm trying to say is context can, one is that we need to be more specific really maybe than so broad, but that when we become more specific, it's double-edged. It can both sharpen the way we understand what you've been talking about in terms of the crossing of the body, of the virtual, the digital, and the physical body. But it can also work towards saying, oh, but we are so specific that it doesn't matter. So how do you deal with that? I'm asking you, how would you suggest one could talk about that? I don't know if I've been, just something which is sort of going on in my head.
No, what I think you're saying, I think is actually a really good question, but correct me later if I got it wrong. And my sense is that it also speaks to the comment that Mary made about feminism and local context, but how I seem to also suggest much more general kind of shifts, right? And I think really, I mean, it's that level of like context is what, context is very local, but do we have broader context also? How does it work? I think both of them speak to the specific challenge perhaps of the datafied society is that in everything that we do now, or in the way data flows operate, there is scale brought in at all times in ways that perhaps didn't exist before, and a variety of scales at the same time, right? So that if you look, for example, at, let's say, if you use a Fitbit or one of these devices to check your heart rate, etc., how many steps you've walked today, right? There is a very specific local context of like what you are doing today with that device, which has a number of questions around it. And it's also, again, actually one example of where you can see that really close interconnection between bodies and data, because many people who start using these devices start to change their actions based on what the device tells them. No, I haven't done 10,000 steps yet today. I need to do another 2,000. My heart rate is this, I need to do that. I've only slept so many hours, I am feeling tired. Like people start to read their experiences even differently, often through their data. There's quite a lot of research on that. So one, in that action, like one level is that context. The other context is then, I guess, you and the relationship to, say, the company from who you have the device, and what happens between these two actors and in that relationship. But the challenge really is that there are so many levels of scale that are immediately connected to these things as well, where the concerns become different. And I think this is part of the challenge and what we don't necessarily see, right? When you put up on Facebook a picture of a party, you might think of the context of you and your friends, but there is the context of Facebook, there is the context of all of the companies that Facebook gives this data to, which might mean that, so in this particular case, even if, say, let's say the party is of a group of queer friends, but one of the people in the party is perhaps not yet out, and is also not on Facebook consciously. When they are in that picture and they are on Facebook and they are there, Facebook will identify them as being queer. And the more information that Facebook manages to gather about this person, even though they decided to stay off Facebook, the more Facebook will actually start to make predictions with higher levels of accuracy. And the starting levels in the case of a company of Facebook, like Facebook of that scale of accuracy, are quite high. So I think the challenge with the kind of contextual and rootedness is partly the fact that the scales are so many, and then what are you looking at, right? And I think what's important also is to start breaking this down more. And I'm not trying to say that like there is a one-size-fits-all solution. So we wrote a paper on consent, which has a number of principles. Now, the colleague with whom I wrote that particular paper is looking at account aggregators in India, which is a new technology that is being designed for people to make it easier. For example, an account aggregator, they're being set up at the moment for the financial sector. So that would mean that the account aggregator, if you sign up with one, they would have the details of all of your financial accounts. And then if you want to, say, apply for a loan with a specific bank, the account aggregator will make a list of the data that they need from all of these different financial accounts that you have, prepare it, ask for your consent, and send it to that bank. So the idea is that having that entity manage it in the middle will make things easier. And especially the idea is that it would make it easier for people from marginalized backgrounds in India to get access, for example, to loans. It's a very specific initiative happening in India, targeted at a very specific group. So what might go, at least in theory, they are arguing that this is meant for specific parts of the population, especially. So what my colleague is doing is taking these principles and then asking, so in this particular context, if that is what supposedly the goal is, what would be concrete qualifier for each principle in terms of how the technology has to be designed to actually make this real, to make the consent meaningful from a feminist perspective while serving these particular parts of the population. And so I think that exercise needs to be done for many more different things for us to get a better sense of where this might be going and how we can deal with all of these different levels and the challenges that they pose at the same time, because they are interconnected. It's also something that will take time though, because there aren't that many people working on this yet. But I do think like there are, so what we did with the principles was to try and propose lines of thinking. The idea that you need to actually take power relationships into account and that meaningful consent between me and Facebook does not exist. Facebook feminism makes that very clear, irrespective of where you are in the world, because of how it is structured. So there are these broader lessons that we can start from and then start to kind of think, use them as a way to think about what does that mean here in this context. I don't know, Rajni, did that clarify at all?
Can I ask?
But I think I myself need to get a little clearer in terms of what I was thinking. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I really learned a lot. And I want to just carry the discussion a little forward on a couple of issues. You know, the classical situation is medicine, where you have, you know, you go undergo a medical procedure and you give a consent. And, you know, you have no idea really of what that procedure is. And it's actually a commercial way that the medical practitioner and the institution protects itself. So, you know, if we take that analog and shift it to other domains, how any information that you provide to the external world, whether it's, you know, through the virtual identities of Aadhaar, or whether it's through other kinds of engagement with the virtual world and even the real world, if you go with that concept, you know, it creates a burden, you know, because you, in a way, you're also empowered. I mean, you suppose I'm wanting to have a medical procedure. I have this whole virtual world to consult and look at and understand. There's a plethora of knowledge and knowledge available to me. The sources of that knowledge to verify that the authenticity, that's my problem again. So this whole thing of, you know, too much burden of knowledge and information being put on an individual, and at some level, maybe ignorance is better, you know, because I like that first slide of yours of data being exploited, the exploitative potential of data. And we seem to be, I mean, it's like, how do you deal with the emotional dimension as an individual, coming back to experience? You cannot challenge it everywhere. I mean, Foucault said that, you know, in the structures of power lies resistance. So in this, if not resistance, how do you negotiate with this world, which is, you've said, you know, in some ways, bring in the context, look at the power, that's all at the level of knowledge. How do you deal with the emotional burden of being dragged into a world where you do not actually have the total resources nor the capacities to engage with it in all its dimensions, and yet you have to be self-protective?
It's a really good question. And so I think people also often ask me, like, what can I do as an individual? And my entire point, I mean, I have been using Signal for half a decade or something. It's suddenly become popular because of all the challenges with WhatsApp. But if you work on these issues, then there are technologies you can use that are safer than others, etc. But the entire point of what I'm trying to say is that we cannot, at the moment, keep ourselves safe within this system, because it is not set up to think about people, right? The power of the metaphors is important. It's important for governments. It's important for businesses to raise people, because both surveillance models from states and business models from companies rely on us not being visible. So, which means that it is really important to start moving to a more collective resistance, where over time we hopefully can reduce that burden by, to start with, not making certain things legal. So, for example, at the moment, the idea that I don't know how many of you have heard of the term behavioral surplus. So most companies, when you sign up with them, you think you give a certain amount of data because they provide you with a service. So let's say that's what Facebook does, right? And then you think they will use their data to improve the service. Increasingly, car makers, toy makers, and this will get worse with the Internet of Things becoming more and more present across the world, right? All use data as well to do other things as well. To learn about people who buy their products and sell that data to other companies, which have products that you had not thought of at all. If you look at a game of Pokemon, actually, this is probably a good example. So the game Pokemon, some years ago, was really popular. People think that they are getting the data because you go and collect these Pokemons while you walk around in the world, looking where you can find Pokemons in somebody's garden. You take those and then you get points. This is what people think they are doing. What was going on behind the scenes is companies, coffee shops, local businesses, etc., paid Pokemon to have Pokemons planted, for example, in their coffee shop to incentivize you to have a coffee there. Because if you had the coffee, you would get extra points. And then the company, Pokemon itself, analyzes that data to see what are things that are popular, etc., and how can we shift this? This is not, we are not thinking while we're playing the game that we are being manipulated and going for a coffee, right? But this is actually what is being happening behind the scene. Now, at the moment, everybody talks about this as if this should be acceptable. That is how data as a resource becomes this thing that drives innovation and growth. This is what innovation and growth is based on. But tell me, when does nudging become manipulation? As a society, we don't really have a broader debate around it, right? And you start to see it a little bit now, for example, when it comes to elections, because there people can recognize this is fundamentally undermining democracy. What is happening with, for example, the targeting of communication around elections is very similar, no? Earlier, a politician would have speeches in public space and all of us would be listening to the same thing. Now they can send you messages personally that are targeted at what they think will actually gel with you. You don't necessarily know what your neighbors are being told by the same politician. Now, how are we going to have a democratic debate if you don't even know that anymore? And should these be things that our data should be allowed to be used for? So the problem is when you put people out of the debate, when you talk about data as a resource, you cannot even raise these questions. No, you can't say, but this should not be illegal. So I think behavioral surplus should not be legal as a business model. I think third-party data sharing, as long as you can't apply feminist principles of consent to it, should not be legal. It's funny though, it's really hard. The first time many people hear me say these things, they'll go like, oh my God, that is so extreme. But that depends on how you look at data. If you actually get immersed in looking at how it starts from people, you will see that the only way to reduce the emotional burden is by making certain things illegal. And the fact that we can't even imagine it right now is precisely because we are going through this paradigm shift, where all these big companies, especially Google and Facebook since the early 2000s, they kept doing things and then saying, but this is the way it is. This is the way it is. This is now 21st century, accept it and move on. As if we can't have a say in it. But you're starting to see the discrepancies develop, right? A decade ago, Zuckerberg said privacy is dead. And a few years ago, he had this big speech with the word privacy in big letters behind him. It shifted because people complained and said, well, I don't want my privacy to be dead, right? You see the same thing happening with facial recognition, for example. In India, facial recognition is being rolled out on a massive scale, even in the private sector, no? How is it possible that there are companies that want to use your facial recognition for you to pay for a cup of tea? This should be made illegal. It means that your anonymity in public space disappears. Gandhi wanted people to go to the villages Ambedkar told his followers, go to the city because it is there. The anonymity of the city is what will make it possible for you to escape caste. In a village, always people will already know who you are. That anonymity gets eroded when you implement facial recognition so widely, right? And the latest is, of course, the police in, what was it, Bhopal, suggesting that if a woman looks distressed when she walks with a man, there should be a signal going to the police station that she is potentially sexual arrest and the police should show up. Like, what kind of surveillance society is that creating? In the US, there are cities that are starting to ban the use of facial recognition in public spaces. It is possible to start to go down a different route, but we need to, first of all, be able to imagine it, and secondly, have a language to talk about it. And so the bodies as data narrative for us is a way to contribute to the development of a language. Put people back at the center, then see what do you do. It's not a short-term solution, I realize, but that's why I'm so grateful at having the chance to talk about this here, because it really needs broad-based movements.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Vandana, go ahead, please.
Carrying on from what you were saying about how what politicians tell us, can also be customized and so on. I've noticed something when using search engines that you look for something, you type in some keywords, and the answer you get, I find, is becoming increasingly unsatisfactory for me. I realize that it is tied up with the location from which I'm asking that question, among many other things, my own search history and so on. I was really alarmed when I first noticed this. But then how much more alarming it will be for young people using search engines, where what they are told about, seemingly told objectively, something like an objective fact, we all talk about the difference between information and knowledge, but this is something else again, that even information is being channeled to you according to who that whole system thinks you are and what they think you are and what you are likely to find useful as knowledge. This, I think, is another alarming aspect of the fact that we are always creating data. It's also what gets back to us. What would you say about this?
I fully agree with you. And I think, so what you're pointing at is this personalization, which is really the way in which behavioral surplus gathering is sold to us. It's sold in the name of personalization. And for some things, you might find that useful, right? It's not as if I am still on Facebook. It's not as if I've never clicked on an ad on Facebook, even though I try not to, but every now and then something comes up that just really speaks to me at that moment. They got it right. Like, the thing is, we can't choose, right? We have no control over it. So I agree with you. It's a really, really big problem. Maybe also one thing you reminded me of, since you also talked about like the objectivity question and how difficult it is nowadays to know like what's fact and what's not. I think there are interesting experiments happening with how perhaps that can be done easier. For example, around morphed images, I think it's Japan that has a new law where if an image has been in some way adapted, or a video, I think it's specifically for videos actually, you need to put a watermark on it that shows that. And I think, so again, it's a simple thing. Yeah, it's not that complicated to do. But in many places, we don't even think about these things, right? We don't even think about, so then how do you actually deal with this? Once you see the problem differently, you can find solutions.
Mm.
But it's gonna get worse before it's gonna get better, I think.
Yes. The point you're making, though, is that once we do understand what the problem is, then perhaps we can understand what kind of laws we need to make. And then, of course, to try and persuade our governments to pass them is a different matter again.
But so I really think it's not only a problem of an issue of understanding the problem, it's also a matter of having a language and then being able to develop an alternative imagination. Because I think the powerlessness many of us feel, so clearly, like a lot of the questions come from people's experiences, right? You have done these searches and you've been frustrated about how that data was clearly changed to target you. I think it was Renu earlier who spoke about that emotional burden, and it bothers you. You have a sense of the problem intuitively there. That's why you are troubled. But how do you even start talking about the language if everybody around you, every government institution, every private company is saying, but this is the way forward. This is the future. This is how we are becoming a developed country. This is how we're all going to get rich by doing this. You don't have a language then. And without language, you can't develop new ideas, no?
Karuna, were you wanting to ask a question because you've opened your video? You'll have to unmute yourself if you wish to ask a question. There's one question in the chat box from Anshu Singh asking, I don't know if you can see it yourself, Anja. It says, may you please suggest some work that looks into the problem-solving part of the problem of big data? And then Rupika Rizam has done some work on that. Is this something you can respond to?
I don't know Rupika's work, and I'm not sure I get the question. What do you mean by the problem-solving part of the problem of big data? Anshu, can you maybe clarify?
Anshu, are you there? Then you could please ask your question again. You could unmute yourself, Anshu, and ask your question, because it's not very clear from what you've written in the chat box. Oh, okay. So she's going to retype it because she doesn't have a mic where she is now. In the meantime, maybe if there's anyone else who has a question.
Hi. Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Hi, Anja. Thanks for a really interesting lecture.
Can I ask you to identify yourselves because we don't know all of you, please?
Yeah, my name is Tehani.
Yeah.
Hi. So, Anja, just really two simple questions, actually. One is, you were talking about, the aggregation of data, right? And if surveillance, right now, with people kind of switching to Signal, I'm wondering if the platforms we're using are dispersed, and we're doing bits and pieces of work on different platforms owned by different companies, and dispersing the kind of surveillance that's happening on the data, is it then more effective for us? I mean, or is the collection of data less effective? And how do you see that kind of playing out if we're using multiple platforms? And the other one was this idea of, identity and representation on platforms like Facebook. Being able to correctly pick our gender, correctly pick, our location or our ethnicity or whatever it is. Is it not better if we can decouple the idea of representation from these kind of capitalist, platforms that are gathering and selling our data? I mean, is it that important that we're represented on platforms like this where we know they're selling our data and we know that, no good really is coming of them collecting our data? Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Okay, maybe first on the dispersed platforms, the centralization at the moment is a part of the problem, right? It's a part also of the problem of the enormous power that some of these companies have and how that is influencing governance around the world, as well as the experiences that we have. So like I said earlier, especially Google and Facebook have been called out for really just constantly like presenting us with a new situation as if it's a fait accompli, can't be questions, this is the way things are now, right? And they kind of tinker with it a little bit when they get pushback. But basically they want to keep coming back to these same things to shift the trends. Having more dispersed platforms, having more platforms, not having that kind of centralization of data also would obviously help. It would hopefully also lead to much more varied ownership, right? And so that whole question of infrastructure is again another thing where I think feminism could have a lot to say about what might be much more, again, local contextualized models that work. And I say contextualized, I even mean for specific groups, for example, etc. But yes, the thing is, platforms alone is not enough. It's also really that business model that we still need to get at, right? Because I think even if they're smaller, it doesn't solve all the problems. It's in the same way that in India, the whole discourse about data colonialism became a big argument in favor of having Indian industry do these things. But really, I'm not more happy if Mr. Ambani has all of my data than I am if Mr. Zuckerberg has all my data. It's a different nationality, but the problem remains the same. No, I know that's not the kind of dispersed platform you know, mean Ambani, but yeah, I do think they're linked. But yes, definitely a start. And on identity and representation questions, the thing is, it's not up to me to decide, no? I think the thing I started to point out is, or what I try to point out is that Facebook makes it seem to its users as if it celebrates gender diversity. While actually when it comes to its money-making models, it still puts us in the binary, and whatever definitioning we might be doing on the forefront for those who want to, actually goes nowhere. Fundamentally, it makes no difference to Facebook because those are not categories that they sell. So it's that kind of hypocrisy that I really wanted to point out. But whether people should or shouldn't, I think those are personal decisions in a way, right? On Facebook, though, I can also say that Facebook has a real name policy. So they defended in the name of safety. Supposedly, people having their real names keeps you safer on a platform, but there is research from the US that shows that that's not the case. And there is research from around the world, including India, that shows that for many people with vulnerable backgrounds, it's actually harmful, right? So let's say if you're a transgender person who's still transitioning and some people know and some people don't, what is your real name? What should you make this profile in, etc. People, activists in India, these are real stories, who didn't want to use a caste last name because of political reasons, also because of safety and security, and Facebook again and again trying to force them to do so. So yeah, in terms of like, I think whether we put our names or not on Facebook, there's many questions to be asked, but
I have a question, Anja, which actually comes from a prior world when it comes to data and the state. And people like me who sort of engage with macro data have tried to sort of live a kind of divided life between good reasons to have data and the wrong reasons to have data. So in order to be able to establish patterns of exclusion, we want to know how many Dalits are there in the media, how many Muslims are there in public service, how many of this and how many of that, and we want the data to be accurate and identity based and so on. And the more we have, the better it is. If we can disaggregate by income, if you can whatever, right? And we think of the census, for instance, with its capacity to give us a macro picture without giving us, without invading the privacy of the individual, as somehow good data, as distinct from the kind of governmentality and the sort of issues that you have been talking to. But so my question is really, will those kind of ideas of good and bad hold up in the world, in the data world that you're talking about? Mm-hmm. Could there be a reason why one would actually want to be identified and named as distinct from not? Or does that actually break down here?
No, I do think that still stands. And maybe I should also say, so part of this paradigm shift happening is that I think we need to fundamentally come to terms with the fact that our bodies will never be the same again. And having data as being part of our bodies means that boundaries perhaps have become even more porous, and it is even more difficult to control. So it's going to be there in any case. And then the question really is how to make it serve us rather than work against us, right? I think that's kind of like the question that is at the heart of all our work. How do we then make it work for us? And specifically on the question that you asked, Mary, there is a very interesting recent book called Data Feminism that really looks at a lot of these questions and asks also, so then what are the conditions that are needed to make it work? And one thing is, of course, again, that communities need to have a say in these things, right? That the data that is going to affect you, that you should actually be able to have a say in what is being collected, how it is being used, etc., how long it's being stored, where it's being stored, who can have access to it. And there are initiatives in some parts of the world, like in Canada, some of the First Nations have made a lot of, they've argued very strongly in favor of being able to have that control over data themselves rather than just giving it to the Canadian state, and then building processes and systems around this, right? And again, it's that question of, yeah, yes, of course, representation is important. But I was, last May in a webinar organized by Apnalaya, an organization that works in Mumbai in slum communities. And they were addressing the issue how during the pandemic, lockdown, still early stages at that time, funders just wanted such detailed data of everybody they were helping in one way or the other, that as an organization, they themselves felt this was unethical. And they actually turned down some funding because of that, which I really thought was, I mean, that's rare and those are difficult decisions, but I also thought it was really admirable. But they were also pointing out that funders want all of this data, but at the same time, we know that, for example, the municipal corporation knows that they are undercounting certain things that if they would count them properly would really help to get more money to these areas, which would really help in solving some of these problems. The thing is, there is no political will to count. And on neither sides of this equation are these communities actually consulted about what data do you think matters? What should we actually look at, right? So, yeah, I do think, again, the context, see, again, feminism will have a lot of relevance in terms of the experiences it already has in organizing like that.
Yeah, could you look at, I think Anshu has tried to rephrase her question in the chat box. Could you take a look and see if it's, clearer to you now?
Yes, I do think I get it. And I look at Rubika's work, thank you for flagging that. I think it comes back to Tehrani's question also about, like, should we even put our names on Facebook, right? If you, or to Mary's question about, like, what is good data and bad data, do we need to make sure that diversity is there everywhere? There are Black scholars who pointed out that facial recognition technology in the US is notoriously bad at recognizing the faces of Black people. And It's, if you put it on a spectrum, white men are on one end, they are recognized mostly, and Black women are actually on the other end. They are recognized the least correctly, but they're also targeted a lot, so there's a lot of mistakes being made there. And then people raise that question, so is that a feature or a bug? Do we actually want better representation of Black people in that algorithm? That would be more diversity, but what would it help? So again, I think none of these, you can never answer that question in a vacuum. And this is where maybe also coming back to Rajni's question in the very beginning, right? Where the question of context comes back again. Because I know people are now looking at this in India as well. Are Indian facial recognition algorithms actually able to classify different parts of the population accurately? And I asked the researchers who are working on that, but do you feel that's an ethical question to ask? Why do we need to know that now? If you look at how how facial recognition is being used in India, I'm not sure. I wouldn't ask it. Right? So I hope that answers, Anja.
Any more questions? Otherwise, you know, we are, Nilika, are you?
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation. I think your points are well taken, but I just wanted to share an observation that, you know, I've been looking at Facebook lately, and the identity question there, especially with regard to, you know, women and people with disabilities. And it's very interesting. What you say is correct, that, you know, they have our data and everything. But these are also spaces which connect people of multiple, you know, locations, and which also allow, you know, multiple worlds to interact with each other. So I have in mind some of the close groups, you know, made by women, women professionals, middle-class women professionals, where, you know, it was very interesting to see LGBT people also joining in and coming out. You know, because they felt that it was a safe place. And from, say, a group of 20 people, one of the group has grown in size to almost 1.5 lakh people, women. So it is very interesting that, you know, these are all middle-class women professionals, and who had very little in common, except that, you know, of the class location. But they are able to have these conversations also about data, conversations also about safety and surveillance. And the group admins have made sure that, you know, the data, obviously, you know, the background data is obviously with Facebook, but the kind of conversations and the kind of connections that people are able to make, I think, kind of create for very empowering spaces which were not possible physically. And the same goes for the, you know, persons with disabilities. So just wanted to share that, you know, there is a possibility of the politics of representation, and we need to, I think, dig it deeper to understand how people who want to actually have control, or who know how to control, you know, their settings, etc., are able to manage better than those who possibly, you know, are not aware as much.
I definitely, I mean, obviously the empowering parts of the internet are still really important, right? And actually, the work of the Internet Democracy Project always tries to make the point that we should never throw out the baby with the bathwater and really retain that. I think for us, it's also a really big concern, for example, in the conversations around online abuse, where the conversation often goes as if online abuse is the defining experience of being a woman, specifically on the internet today. And yet, if you frame it like that, then actually all those empowering conversations that you are talking about are being erased. And all the groups, all the kapanchayats, for example, in the country that are arguing that young women should not have access to mobile technology because they are afraid precisely of the empowering potential of that technology, only get more fodder for their arguments, right? And for me, like apart from, I think definitely queer communities in India and a lot of the changes we have seen over the past few years, I think there is a recognition that the internet has played an important role in it. But also, for example, if you look at how Dalit feminism has started to reshape Indian feminism in general in the past few years. I'm always amazed by how the word Savarna has become a part of everybody's vocabulary in a way that it just wasn't earlier, right? And that's maybe been challenging, but it's amazing that these things have happened. I think it's all for the better. And without the internet, I'm not sure that would have had the same opportunity right now to flourish in that way, right? But what I think is the problem here, and what I'm trying to point out is, so even a lot of the groups that are using Facebook, and like I said, I'm also still on Facebook, there is no finger pointing happening here, for the same reason, like my communities are on Facebook, so I am on Facebook. But there is so much happening at the level of the architecture of that platform that could be very differently without stopping those conversations, but without also leading to the indirect harms to those very same communities, which we might not be able to see directly and which we might not be able to point out immediately because it's also opaque. There are alternative infrastructures possible, right? And again, I think so it's again that question of don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. No, we're not saying data should never be collected. No, we're not saying the internet should stop existing. I wouldn't want it to, right? But there is a lot happening in the background that people are not sufficiently aware of. And in my experience, when they are aware of it, are often horrified by it. So then that becomes an argument to ask for change.
Mary?
Yes.
Mary, Vanita, can I ask a question?
Absolutely. Please identify and please do ask. I think, yes, there's still energy and time.
Okay. So I'm Vanita, and I don't know how to describe myself, so I shall skip that. Yeah. So, I mean, thank you for this very fascinating presentation and talk. I've been thinking about, like when everyone of us saw that thing on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, and were horrified, what you're saying, and you're saying it in so much detail. I think that thing comes out very strongly there then. And then when WhatsApp threatened that they are going to make it, there's no more encryption or whatever, all the data will be there. So we all move to Signal. And one of my friends said, but this is going to happen. So either you completely get out of all this and go back to a feature phone and not a smartphone, or you be in this. So, this is the either or option. What you're saying is, look, there is a way out and there is a feminist approach. We have very interesting feminist concepts, tools to deal with it. But you also mentioned it's in the long term. So, I mean, all of us are quite dependent on this medium, the internet, and all the forms that it brings during lockdown and later, our life, our connection, our communities. I mean, we're attending meetings here. Maybe there's data being collected even now as we speak. We don't know. So what is the medium term, the short term? How do we protect ourselves? That's one question, if you have any ideas on that, because the other thing is too long. The second thing is, I understand what you mean by context is important and power relation. And power relation is a default because it's a one-way process of collecting data. But when you say context and you gave those specific examples of the airport and all that, the body scanners, it was very clear. The Aadhaar thing is clear, but I think there's a spectrum of context. How do we then conceptualize context itself at this very macro meta data collection level, because these are all different contexts and there's a spectrum. How do you handle that?
On the second question, I think it comes back to some of the earlier ones as well. And I want to think a little bit more about how you framed it specifically. But I think, again, maybe some of the very macro ones should not be allowed in the first place. Maybe it also comes back to Tahani's point about distributed infrastructures, right? Maybe we really should start thinking about much more localized models of doing these things, though of course a lot of the value of all the technology is also being able to connect across at least geographic contexts. What I'm wondering, and I'm really thinking aloud now, is whether maybe there is ideas of how to think about this in anthropological work that looks, for example, at global value chains, because there you have very similar challenges, I guess, right? Of the levels being so many and the macro and the micro interconnected in so many ways, so that a factory worker in India or in Bangladesh and a consumer, whether in Delhi or in New York, and everything that happens in between in terms of the political economy of global policy making, etc., and how all of that is connected. I'm wondering if perhaps there is productive ways to think through that question of how do you conceptualize it specifically. But I don't have the answer right now. So, but thanks for asking. On the protection issue, I do think it's important to try and educate yourself. So, and I do think that Netflix documentary helped a lot, because like you're saying, a lot of people who saw it were horrified. It explains these things quite well. And one of the big shortcomings though was that a lot of the fundamental contributions to this field, asking these critical questions, have been made by women of color, and almost all the speakers in that documentary were white men. But the essence of what it was trying to convey is definitely very similar to what I'm trying to say here. The protection is though about starting to understand these things and then trying to make different choices. And that's why I do think this often happens when there is a crisis, right? After Snowden happened, privacy suddenly got a lot more attention internationally. I think that really was what killed Zuckerberg's privacy is dead discourse, because people were horrified. And so each time when there is a scandal like that, you see that there is a certain shift. But by educating ourselves more, talking about these things in our communities, we can start to make these different choices to send the signal, right? Because the shift to Signal has sent the signal to WhatsApp. And the company is not necessarily going to be impacted enough. And yet it will be interesting to see where this is going to go, right? So I do think these actions matter. I also think it's really important not to be defeatist and say, oh, but you have to change all of this. Clearly, if it is such a large structural problem, that is not possible. And for all of us then to just put our hands in the air and say like, well, then there is nothing we can do, means it will never change, right? So I think another really important thing to do, it doesn't keep you safe, is but to speak up about what bothers you. And actually say these things, because it's only when there are enough people who express the discontent that people find each other, start having these conversations about alternatives, start thinking about what it could look like, start formulating solutions, starting small. But I think when we started this work, actually, I used to say to people, because in the very beginning when we had only very basic ideas around this, people would say to me, but are you sure of this? And I would be like, in 50 years time, we are going to look back at today and say, how is it possible that people could not see this then? How did they allow all of these things to happen? How is it okay? How can it be that you tick a box on a form and say, I agree, and supposedly sign away all your rights to privacy? There is no other fundamental human right that you can sign away with a tick of a box. I cannot sign away my right to freedom of expression if I want to. I cannot sign away, as I said, right to life. You can't sign yourself into slavery. How is it that privacy we can just sign away? And so I think speaking about these things and talking about it is really, really important, because otherwise it becomes normalized and then we will be stuck with the status quo. But if enough work happens in the next decade or so, I think some of this can still be regained. And in the meantime, yes, educate, talk to people, find out about technologies, and decide, just accept that it won't be perfect. It's not possible. That's not on you either.
Thank you, Anja. I thought that was a marvelous way to bring things together and give us, I think what you've done for us is that on the one hand, we feel we are so remote, that our feminisms are so remote from this new world, and it can be so disempowering when we feel that. And yet you're telling us that if we can start thinking in certain ways, then actually there is a pathway that is actually getting created. And I think that's really very important in times like now, where we can be completely dashed to the ground by so much. So thank you, Anja. Thanks also to Vasanthi for having, brought you to CWDS in that 20 years ago moment. And thanks all of you, those of you who are with us still. And please,
can I just come in for a last comment?
Please, Arpita, please go ahead.
I just want to switch on my video for this. I don't know if you remember me, Anja ma'am, but when you taught at AUD, we were the MA class you taught.
Oh, hi.
And why? And some of my classmates are here. I don't know if they've logged out yet. So it's 40 years of CWDS, but it's exactly a decade of when you taught FRM, feminist research methods, to us. So as I was sitting through this, for me, it was sitting in your classroom again, and you were the one who introduced the magical word of feminist epistemology to, at least for me. And because most of my teachers are here, I'm a PhD student in the AUD CWDS collaborative program, and my research is on women's studies degrees. So I think, and I'm writing currently my chapter on feminist pedagogy. So the question of feminist teachers is dominating my head right now. So as useful as this lecture was, I have nothing to say, much to say, a lot to think about certainly, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, that 10 years ago when you did that in that classroom, and that probably has shaped my academic trajectory more than you would know as a feminist teacher. So when you insisted in the beginning that this is not about gender and data, but it's about feminist approaches to data, and in the middle you said something about people considering you extreme for insisting that being feminist also means clamping down on certain things. So I think I took a lot from your teachings back then about approaching things in a feminist way, including knowledge and institutions. So just wanted to bring that in before we close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arpita. It's really nice of you to give this message. It's wonderful to hear. And I'm also, since you're speaking of feminist teachers, so I think 20 years ago, Vasanthi passed that flag to me, and then 10 years ago, I passed it on to you, and I'm sure you will continue to pass it on, all in the context of this one institution. It's really nice, I think, to see that connect across. But thanks so much for sharing this. That's you make my day.
Thank you, Arpita. Thank you, Anja, and all of you for being with us today in what has been a really remarkable presentation and thinking out loud together. I really, really enjoyed the discussion. Join us again on March 15th, when we hope to have Jennifer Nash with us talking about the institutionalization of intersectionality. So I hope to see you all, and thanks, and bye for now.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, CWDS. Thank you, Anja.
Mary, to Vasanthi.
Thank you, Anja, for a really stimulating lecture. And well, it leaves us a lot to sort of pursue and follow up and understand. Thank you so much. And we'll of course meet up again. Thank you.
Yes, I look forward to that. And thank you to all of you for bearing with me for 2 hours. So thanks so much.
Okay, bye.